Dear students, today we are going to discuss about the TBT agreement and the packaging rules first and also the Indian institutions in this class. And the next class we will deal with the Indian the rules and regulations. So, if we look into the TBT agreement, you can see that. So, the all classes last two classes we were discussing about the TBT agreement and its requirements, measures and other things. So, how the food labeling is done and what is the importance of the TBT agreement. So, the agreement clearly says that, which talks about the how packaging as well as labeling is basically done and also how it is distinguished from SPS measures and what are the requirements of a technical regulation. And also we can see that all over the world, if you look into the standards, there are so many standard setting bodies. So, you can find so voluntarily standard setting organizations and voluntarily standard setting organizations and mandatorily standard setting organizations. And so, some of them are, and mostly the voluntary standard setting organizations are there in the is in the so annually in most of the countries, whether it is a food authorities, whether it is on technical products or electronic products. So, voluntary standard setting organizations are all over the world. So, the standards are set in two categories, and one is the voluntary and other one is the mandatory. So, here we can see that under the technical regulations and the compare with the product standards, these mandatory product regulations are there in every country according to the domestic laws, and voluntary product standards are set by the standard setting organizations, or it different from different sectors. And also the TBT look into the conformity and assessment procedures, that basically the testing, laboratory regulations and related matters is also, that is conformity assessment procedures related to the laboratory work, testing, assessment, certification, all these are also required to be under the TBT agreement. So, basically TBT agreement look into the mandatory product standards, voluntary product standards and conformity assessment procedures. And also you can see that the competing so called objectives. I would say that the TBT agreement is specifically focused on the prevention of protectionism, and the non discrimination principle is applicable to the TBT agreement as well. So, once the product regulations are approved by a particular country as a and once it is published and reported to the technical committee of the TBT agreement or the committee on TBT agreement, and in the last classes we saw that any such SPS or TBT measures should be based on scientific evidence, especially the SPS measures should be based on the risk assessment and scientific evidence. Otherwise, you cannot impose such restrictions as TBT measure or SPS measure. So, here we can clearly look into the TBT also is deal with both, for example, protection of life, health, safety, protection of national security, protection of environment and prevention of deceptive marketing practices. So, if we look into the, so we have discussed about protection of life, health of human, animal and plant health elaborately in the last classes. So, if you look into the last point, the prevention of deceptive marketing practices, that is an is addition in addition to the protection which is added to the TBT agreement. Because if you can see domestic laws with regard to, not only with regard to packaging and other prescriptions are which you can find the packaging rules. So, even for example, in India the Weight and Measures Act also prescribes certain prescriptions under the TBT agreement, and which will we will see in the next class. So, here if we look into, so the first we look into these standards, then we will see that these some of the important cases which you have mentioned in our last class. So, here the obligations, what is exactly the obligation of every member country under the TBT agreement? So, in easy asbestos case, one of the first cases, so which is transferred from the GATT to the WTO dispute settlement system, the appellate body very clearly said. So, what are the obligations of the members? So, the AB said that further the objectives of GATT 1994, it does so through a specialized legal regime that applies solely to a limited class of measures. So, you cannot apply any measure which is not mentioned under the TBT agreement other than what is mentioned in SPS and TBT agreement. And also you can see that there is an obligation on the members that it seems to be different from. So, that means is a different measure or an additional measure to the obligations imposed other than GATT 1994. It means that GATT 1994 provisions are a part of the present TBT agreement. So, the members to look into the GATT obligations as well. So, the TBT measure means it is over and above the TBT agreement plus GATT obligations. So, in the EC asbestos case, the appellate body said that although the TBT agreement is intended to further the objectives of 1994, so we saw that it is a specialized legal regime, emphasis on that it is a specialized legal regime, and TBT agreement imposes obligations on members different from and addition to. So, it is different from and in addition to. So, it is very clear that it is the TBT obligations plus GATT obligations are applicable to the parties. And we saw in some of the cases, SPS vis-a-vis TBT. So, in the easy B hormone case which we discussed last class as well, here the panel very clearly said that since the measures in disputes are sanitary measures, we find that the TBT agreement is not applicable to this dispute. So, it means there is a clear demarcation between SPS agreement and TBT agreement. If it is an SPS measure, you have to impose SPS agreement and its obligations. If there is a TBT measure, if there is a technical regulation, if there is a packaging, or you can see that packaging and also labeling measure, then it can be a TBT measure. So, the TBT measure should be separated from the SPS measure. And another important case is the easy biotech case, easy approval and marketing of biotech products case, the Canada versus Argentina and other countries versus EU. So, here you can see that alternate claims in SPS and TBT. So, and it says that TBT agreement is, so what the panel said, the measures were found to be covered by the TBT agreement in addition to or instead of the SPS agreement. The panel found that the measures at issue were SPS measures and consequently did not address the claims under the TBT agreement. So, if you take the EU biotech case or easy the beef hormone case, the judgment is very clear, there is a distinction between SPS measure and TBT measure. So, when we comes to the US Indonesia clove cigarettes case, so here the panel very clearly in with reference to article 1(5) of the TBT agreement. So, it said that SPS measures as defined in annex A of the SPS agreement excluded from the scope of TBT agreement. It says that there is no automatic application of SPS measures in case of a TBT measure. TBT measure and SPS measures are different. So, if you look into the facts of this particular case, so Indonesia and US was in at loggerheads with regard to menthol cigarettes and clove cigarettes. So, clove cigarettes or menthol cigarettes are very popular in US. So, the US argued that the clove cigarettes and menthol cigarettes imported from Indonesia are different, they are not like products, and but at the same time the panel very clearly said that menthol cigarette and clove cigarettes are like products. So, the end result is these measures applicable. If a measure is not applicable in the US on clove cigarettes, then you can menthol cigarettes also it is not applicable. So, either other way around. So, menthol cigarettes and clove cigarettes are like products. So, if you are imposing an SPS measure or a TBT measure on the imported products, then you have to impose it on the domestically manufactured products as well. So, the national treatment principle is applicable. And also here you can see that TBT measures ranges a wide range of products which is applicable. And here you can see that even we said that energy saving devices in the last class which we discussed about, even electrical goods, the mandatory standards. For example, as in India, every electrical product should have an ISI, old ISI mark and the new BIS mark. So, there may be a standard for shape of food cartons. So, we will see later what are the new packaging rules, and also you can see include pharmaceutical restrictions, labeling, health warnings, labeling in cigarette packets, and also you can see that disease controlling mechanisms. So, plants, animals, etc. So, we saw that all these are related to the SPS measures, not related to the TBT agreement. And also we can clearly say that the regulations, standards, testing, certification, and all these are related to TBT, but the condition is very clear, it should not make unnecessary obstacles to treat. So, we talked about the Euro standards or the counterpart Bharat standards for all vehicles, mandatory emission standards, labeling, mandatory labeling of cigarettes, mandatory nutritious content label, regulation of recycling of plastic and paper. So, we will see 2023 Indian regulation, testing, certification like ISI marks earlier, ISO marks, now the BS marks. It is mandatory, in some cases it is mandatory, in some cases it is voluntary in nature. So, we can see a different terms. So, the first picture shows the power saving gate. So, which shows that it is 5 star, 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star and 5 star, and these are the voluntary standards for energy saving or power saving. So, the second and third picture which shows the old cigarette packet and the new cigarette packet. So, you can see certain specific spaces is used to be or certain sizes, certain size of warning to be put in the cigarette packets. So, now 60% minimum 60% of the space should be used for the warning, and also a picture is shown in the present cigarette packets, and also it is it's written smoking kills. So, the earlier packets only says that the cigarette smoking is injurious to health. So, this picture and smoking kills, its effect on its consumers, customers or the smokers is different from the earlier one, and also it is written tobacco causes cancer. So, from time to time, so this is a mandatory labeling requirement, and the packets, the size of the packets also should be maybe mandatory labeling standards. So, and also you can see that certain other packaging in other countries. So, if especially the food products, because it have an impact on the customers or the consumers. So, if you mandatorily ask all the people to put a buffalo picture in the packets as a packaging regulation, it may have a negative impact on the consumers, people those who do not like buffalo milk. So, some people may like only cow milk or goat milk or any other milk, may not be the buffalo milk. So, but it is very clear that it will depend upon the domestic rules and regulations. So, still the question exists, if such a mandatory picture has to be put and what its rationale. So, definitely these packaging rules not depend upon any scientific evidence or risk assessment. So, it is a packaging rule, which if it is insisting on indiscriminatory way, then definitely it is valid. So, this type of questions also can come under the TBT agreement to deal with. So, I already talked about the clove cigarettes and also the menthol cigarettes. So, as I told you, the flavored cigarettes, the US has banned certain flavored cigarettes and it excluded the menthol cigarettes, which is popularly used in the United States. So, the clove cigarettes were imported from Indonesia. So, Indonesia took the US to the panel, the WTO dispute settlement system, and finally, the panel held that the clove cigarettes and menthol cigarettes are like products for the purposes of the TBT agreement. It means that if you are imposing a restriction, a ban on menthol cigarettes, then clove cigarettes also you can ban, but you cannot give any exception to the menthol cigarettes. It is very clear. So, it means you are discriminating between the domestic menthol cigarettes and the imported clove cigarettes. So, one of the cardinal principle of TBT is first one, the non-discrimination principle, and the two is very clearly said that if you are putting unnecessary obstacle to trade, non-discrimination plus unnecessary obstacle to trade. So, you cannot make an SPS measure or TBT measure to be making unnecessary obstacles to trade. So, if you look into the food labeling at the TBT, and the TBT agreement does not prescribe any specific method of labeling or packaging regulations or labeling regulations, and it simply says that every country has the freedom to come out with their packaging regulations and also the other regulations, which is related to, for example, special labeling requirements and nutritional claims. For example, milk packet, we will see in the next class what is the special rules with regard to milk and milk products. You have to declare the nutritional claims, labeling requirements, packaging requirements, and what are the other requirements. So, that means even in some cases it will entirely depend upon the domestic law to take care of, and in certain cases, for example, veterinary drugs, the pesticide residues and the content, the food additives, and relating to the SPS agreement also to be taken care of. And it does not mean that packaging and labeling is exclusively TBT. Even in certain cases relating to the food, the SPS measure also come into play. So, that means SPS and TBT measures in sometimes go hand in hand. So, it is very important, if it is a technical regulation, it will come under the TBT agreement. So, what is this technical regulation? In the easy sardine case, the appellate body and also the panel considered it, and the appellate body confirmed it that what are the requirements of a technical regulation. So, it clearly says a document which lays down product characteristic or their related process and production methods, including the applicable administrative provisions with which compliance is mandatory, and also it may also include or deal exclusively with terminology, symbols, packaging, marking or labeling requirements as they apply to product, process or production method. So, in the easy sardine case, the appellate body formulated three mandatory criteria to be determined as a technical regulation. What are these three criteria? The first one, this applies to an identifiable product or group of products, and 2, it must lay one or more product characteristics, and 3, compliance with these characteristics must be mandatory. So, this constitute basically these are the conditions to constitute whether it is basically to determine whether it is an SPS measure or TBT measure. So, if it is complying with these three criteria, then it will be termed as a technical regulation which will come under the TBT agreement. So, it is very simple. If the law says that if a fridge, a refrigerator to be of 1 meter height, it is a technical regulation. And also here you can see that a packaging, if a law says that if a packaging is must be recyclable, then it is an example of technical regulation. So, I hope that this what you exactly mean by the technical regulation, the sardine case also, and the examples are also very clear what you exactly mean by a technical regulation. If it is a technical regulation, it must come under the TBT agreement rather than SPS agreement. I think we have dealt with all these cases, and the first case which you can see, the EC trademarks and geographical indications, it's Australia versus European community. Here also the panel found that the measure, whether all these cases, the question was whether it is a SPS measure or TBT measure. So, this case also the panel found that it was not a technical regulation. It was not a technical regulation. It means that what is technical regulation? We already saw that what are the conditions. So, if the regulation of the particular action fulfills the criteria of technical regulation, then only it will come under the SPS a TBT agreement, TBT agreement, and otherwise you have to challenge the particular measure under the SPS agreement. So, and also it is very clearly the technical regulations, the complete freedom is to be given to the member countries to prepare these technical regulations. And these technical regulations, the only one condition which we again reiterated is it should not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. So, you cannot distinguish between menthol cigarettes and clove cigarettes. These are like products. So, one you ban, the other you do not ban. So, this is not allowed under the WTO TBT agreement. So, quickly we will come to the Indian institutions, and Indian institutions dealing with especially TBT agreement and SPS agreements. And here the Bureau of Indian Standards, BIS, and formerly it was known as Indian Standard Institution, which was established in 1947 immediately after the independence of the country. This is the national standard setting body, and presently it is the BIS, and it was changed the name after the BIS Act of 1986. So, BIS is now engaged in standard formulations, certification, testing, and related activities, and even consumer education. And now we can see that this BIS is participating in the codex work as well in creating international standards as well. So, India BIS is the standard setting body for all the products, and you can see the BIS even the contact point is clearly reported to the committee on TBT. So, you have a special office, a special officer, and there is a telephone number, and there is a email address, so that you can ask any questions relating to the TBT to this particular office. And also you can see that there are various departments of the central government is dealing with quality regulation. So, Director General of Foreign Trade or foreign exports and imports dealt by the Director General of Foreign Trade. Then individual regulatory agencies, and BIS have mandatory standards for 109 products, and this we can clearly see what are those particular products. And export products, you can see the Export Inspection Council of India. So, 1000 notified products will be checked by the Export Promotion Council or Export Inspection Council. So, again you can see the BIS mandates 109 products, mandatory standards for 109 products, which includes food colors, food additives, cements, gas cylinders. So, we can see and very various categories or products, which includes even infant milk products, steel tubes, we talked about electrical appliances, packaged drinking water, thermometers. So, the list goes. There are 109 products requires mandatory certification. So, please go through the list of BIS certification, so which is publicly available. There is a long list. So, India has imposed mandatory certification for 109 products. And if you look into regulatory agencies, this is a huge problem. There are multiple agencies involved in quality regulation. And in the beginning of this class, we said that per year, so one country, the United States, rejects more than 3000 consignments. Even though so much of multiple regulatory agencies, I would say regulatory agencies or quality agencies, quality regulation agencies, why these products are rejected. So, you can see from the Directorate General of Health Services, Ministry of Food Processing and Industry, Industrial Promotion and Policy, Directorate of Marketing and Inspection, Department of Agriculture and Cooperation, Animal Husbandry, Legal Metrology, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, Control of Explosives, and Directorate General of Mines and Safety, Ministry of Road Transport, Central Pollution Control Board, and then you can see a series of agencies which is dealing with. So, all these the agencies dealing with these mandatory standards and regulations. So, every area, so you can find one regulatory agency, but how much regulation is happening is the moot question. So, we can see that a n number of, I would say that there is a sizable number of legislations are also in India to deal with the SPS and TBT measures. And the most important one is the earlier the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act, the first one of 1954, and which was now repealed by the Food Safety and Standards Act 2006. Then there are different orders. For example, the Milk and Milk Products Order 1992, which is from time to time it is amended, even recently also it is amended. Then Standard on Weights and Measures Act and Bureau of Indian Standards Act, which we talked about, the BAS. Then Livestock Importation Act of 1898, the mandatory the mandatory marking of agricultural products, the standards, the AGMARK Act of 1937, British time. So, Infant Milk and Feeding Bottles and Infant Food Products or Foods Act, Export Quality Control and Inspection Act, Essential Commodities Act, Indian Explosive Act, Energy Conservation Act. So, we saw these agencies dealing with these particular legislations as well. So, India is not there is sufficient number of laws. It is not the case that there is no law to deal with food safety or it is packaging or labeling. There is n number of legislations, and here we can see that the inquiry points, or basically the BAS is looking into the questions with this regarding to market access, BAS certification, and then the CE marking, acceptance of so IECCB scheme, and equivalence of standards, and also handling of the country notifications. So, BAS is the nodal agency or nodal point or the inquiry point with regard to the TBT agreement. So, in conclusion, I would say that TBT agreement is providing a platform for every country to have technical regulations, food standards, and at the same time subject to certain restrictions. and these regulations, every member country is free to adopt any standards, but it should not be make unnecessary obstacle to trade. And SPS basically focuses on food standards or animal standards or plant standards you can find, or plant health, and TBT mainly focuses on protection of human wealth relating to technical standards. So, and India, so we will see more about the Indian regulations and Indian laws in the next class, and definitely India is one of the largest country in the world with the largest population. So, we have to in detail we have to look into the TBT measures vis-a-vis the domestic laws. Thank you.